Hello, I'd like to welcome you to this discussion, which is taking place today with Nira Yuval-David, Miriam David, and myself, Richard Kuper. We're all members of JVL's education group on anti-Semitism, and the topic for discussion amongst us today is to look at anti-Semitism in the context of other forms of racism. Nira.
Yes, I think that today there is quite international, not just national debate about the relationship between racism and anti-Semitism, whether anti-Semitism is one form of racism or whether anti-Semitism is something different from racism and in some context, even in contradiction with it. And this is not just about the relationship between racism and anti-Semitism, but it also relates to other much wider perspective on society and politics, democracy, liberalism, capitalism, as well as imperialism and colonialism. Those who see racism and anti-Semitism as different things link anti-Semitism to a perspective or an approach which sees anti-Semitism and probably other forms of racism as well as something which is an aberration of democracy and human rights, which are the fundamentalism of liberalism and the working of contemporary society. And therefore, if we work hard, we can erase it and see the Holocaust as a symbol of the utmost aberration of this paradigm of liberalism and human rights, like Zygmunt Bauman called about the Holocaust as a dark side of modernity. On the other hand, we see those who see racism as an integral part of the working of capitalism and liberalism as part of liberal democracy as part of the work of contemporary capitalism and neoliberalism. Because without post-colonialism, imperialism, and racialization of different groupings of people in the global south, but also of racialized minorities in the global north, this kind of society and economy and politics would not be able to continue to work. This is the approach which sees racism and anti-Semitism as in conflict. And the debate is especially hot because while you can separate the discussion about anti-Semitism and about racism and deal with it in completely different ways, when it reaches the questions of Israel-Palestine, you cannot. Because those who justify the establishment of the state of Israel or of the approval of the Zionist movement, because of course the Zionist movement preceded many, many years to the Nazi Holocaust during Second World War. But those who legitimized the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948, where the indigenous population was a Palestinian, cannot justify the solving of the issue of the persecution of the Jews of anti-Semitism by the settler colonialism of the Zionist movement, and definitely the occupation of the Palestinian, the discrimination of the Palestinian, because if we see this as the situation in which the Palestinian lives as a necessary sacrifice in order to solve the issue of anti-Semitism, then there is an inherent conflict of interest. And those who see racism as part of the issues of racism, colonialism, and imperialism all over the world would support the Palestinians and of course will fight against the occupation and so on, and therefore anti-Semitism would be seen to be something which is not part of it. And those who support the fight against anti-Semitism in this kind of terms would see any kind of attack of Israel as a racist endeavor, like, for example, the International Holocaust Remember definition, as something which is anti-Semitic, would see the two things as completely in conflict. But of course, we have a very different approach. For us, anti-Semitism is a form of racism.
Thank you, Nira. Can I ask you, though, if we could say a little bit more about the history of this approach? Because anti-Semitism, as you rightly say, predated by at least, well, for centuries, but in the build-up to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, apart from the Second World War, there was a wider history of anti-Semitism, particularly in the 19th century, which led to a particular Zionist ideology, didn't it? And led to different currents about forming either a homeland or a state in the area that then was called Palestine as a solution to a problem of anti-Semitism. And is that kind of approach what you would call a wider form of racism, or is it separate? And does that illustrate how anti-Semitism is separate from other forms of racism?
There is no doubt that Jews have suffered for many centuries from discrimination, from exclusion. They were not allowed in many places to join guilds. They were not allowed to own lands. They were confined to a particular occupation. I'm talking about Europe, but also in other parts of the world, they tended to have specific, as of course other ethnic communities in what we call today ethnic communities in most of the world used to be. But in Europe, of course, with the establishment of, after the French Revolution, of nation states on the one hand, and also resistance to the more late post-feudal system in East Europe, of course, we see very severe persecution, both legal, but also, of course, religious and social in many parts of Europe and other places. And of course, Jews were looking for ways to overcome it. They were not the only racialized communities that were looking for a place in which they can just live by themselves and then be free and equal, and nobody can racialize them, nobody can discriminate against them, nobody can exploit them. We know that modern Liberia was established by Blacks from United States, ex-slaves that thought to come back to Africa, and which they will become all liberated. And many settler societies, including, for example, the United States, that were persecuted religious minorities that were hoping to find empty lands in which they will be able to settle their own ideal communities and societies and be free. The trouble, of course, is that virtually nowhere were empty, but the indigenous people in most places were invisible. The Zionist movement was a very late development, and therefore it also chose, because of the historical religious connection with what was called the promised land by God, or the Holy Land to the Christian, and it was also sacred to the Muslims, a very crowded place, one of the most crowded societies in the Middle East. And because it was so late and because it was so crowded, they couldn't, although they tried to say that the country was empty, but of course, yeah, it wasn't, and it wasn't also not in other places, whether it was Australia or Americas and so on. So the issue is that you don't solve racism against one group by settler colonialism, which creates other racialized minorities, other exploitations, other exclusions. And of course, there are many different forms that we're not going to deal with it, but this is in essence what the Zionist movement way to try and solve the issues of anti-Semitism. Of course, there were other movements among Jews and among non-Jews who tried to find solution to what's known as a Jewish question in other ways. Another national movement was the Bund, which also socialist movement, which tried to look for self-determination for Jews in Eastern Europe within some kind of a confederation in which they would have a cultural and political autonomy, although not separate territory. There were others, of course, in terms of Western Europe, the Jewish emancipation, which just said Jews are citizens like any others, and therefore they should have rights and duties like anybody else. Of course, all these solutions were not ideal. Racism is very, very difficult to deal with. And we know that one of the reasons, for example, that Herzl, the leader of the Zionist movement, who was a secular, assimilated journalist, became a Zionist because he covered the Dreyfus trial in France, a secular Jewish officer in the French army. Then, while for other racialized minorities, it can be their visibility that create their feeling of threat. Among in Western Europe, where often was it, like in the Dreyfus case, the Jewish invisibility that created this sense of threat, this kind of conspiracy. We can't see them, and therefore they are going to control us or to do us harm in other ways. So, of course, all these things and all different racisms have their own different tropes, their own different histories, their own different specificities. But they have also things in common. And this is something which we have to remember. They all see and separate between us who belong and the other. And this is a difference which is not permeable. The other cannot just by wanting to be part of us can become part of us, or even if formally they get citizenship, they cannot be like one of us. And very often, these ideologies of difference is used in order to inferiorize the other, in order to make them more available to be exploited, to be excluded. And of course, both symbolic and actual power is used always in order to keep the other as an other. And in this sense, Jews, in much of their history that you mentioned, Mickey, and of course, Blacks, Roma, I mean, we have to remember that even the Nazis and the Nazi Holocaust, the Jews were not the only racialized group that were aimed at extermination. And the Roma, for example, was another. But million others were also killed.
Of course, in the long term, the Slavs were the real enemy whom the Nazis would have turned against and who were regarded as racially inferior in the way in which Jews and Roma were treated.
Well, the Slavs were there to be exploited as slaves, while the Jews and the Roma were to be excluded in the most ultimate way, i.e., genocide, completely get rid of. They didn't necessarily wanted to kill all the Slavs because they wanted them as available slaves. So, although of course the Nazis were looking to expand and they were prepared to accept Slavs as servants and local cooperator who helped them to get rid of the Jews and the others that they wanted to get rid of. Yeah.
There is also the question of what happened to homosexuals. So there was twice as many people were killed as the number of Jews. So it was 12 million altogether killed by the Nazis and Russia or the Soviet Union, and only 6 million Jews. I mean, in other words, Jews were only half the number of people that died in the Holocaust. Although the term Holocaust is very often used only to talk about the murder of Jews.
And of course, not the Jews were not killed only by concentration camps, but almost half of them, like my extended family, were killed by the Eisengruppe in the woods in Eastern Europe before the establishment. However, the concentration camps, it's important to remember, were invented not by the Nazis,
but by the British.
First of all, even the Germans used them in Africa before they used them in Europe. But of course, also the British and other imperial forces. So this is why those who see anti-Semitism and racism as completely different phenomena completely lack the historical perspective and the links and the different ways of power and violence, as well as certain uses of so-called science that has been used in order to exclude and exploit and inferiorize and discriminate against all forms of racialized groupings in different places at different times, but also at the same time and at the same place. Eugenics, another form of this pseudo-science of measuring skulls and so on, were used against blacks and other forms of racialized minorities. Yeah.
I think you can see these trends at work when you look at responses to the Holocaust and what the general lesson of the Holocaust is said to be. And you can divide it roughly into two opposing kind of tendencies. One is to say never again to anyone, and the other is to say never again to us. And I'm sure that all of us brought up in Jewish worlds experienced both of these as lessons that people drew in the post-Second World War period.
Of course, I grew up in Israel, and as you said, never again was to Jews, and in my personal history, and never again to anybody, and of course to what the Israel was doing to the Palestinians was very, very important. But what is also interesting is not just about never again to us or not, but the non-Jewish perspective at the Holocaust, because we have a whole string of philosophers as well as politicians in Europe which colluded with the perspective that the Holocaust was something completely unique that never happened and cannot happen to any other people. And this is part of this Jewish exceptionalism, which have helped to make especially Western countries so forgiving of everything that Israel has been doing for so long, because what happened to the Jews is incomparable in the Holocaust, is incomparable to what happened to anybody else. And here is again this kind of two paradigm, two approaches, two perspective, which says, no, what happened in the Holocaust was absolutely horrific, and probably for the way that it was done and its scale maybe was unprecedented. But at the same time, to establish, for example, a Holocaust Memorial Day as the day in which any genocide anywhere in the world continuously will always be compared as the Holocaust, is always the utmost and the archetype, and in a way the gravest of all other forms of genocide all over the world, is something which have contributed to this so-called competitive perspective between what was done to the Jews and what was done to others. Because if racism's logic is exclusion as well as exploitation, and genocide is the ultimate exclusion, slavery is the ultimate exploitation, in most concrete cases, like in the concentration camps, Jews were also slave labor until they were exterminated. And of course, if we look at African slaves, millions died, excluded. And of course, also in other cases of colonialism, whether it was a systematic extermination, or was it as a result of disease, or was it as a result because they were not considered human and it was cheaper to work them until they die and bring others, and therefore not to supply any kind of conditions when they are on the ships to the plantation or whatever. This is something which in different kind of forms. And Israel, for example, until now would not recognize that the Armenians underwent genocide in Turkey, because it would not allow any Holocaust or any genocide to happen before the Holocaust. So they say genocide can be considered to start only in Second World War. These were also this pseudo-history, pseudo-scientific absolutisms, which creates facts in a completely arbitrary and ahistorical way, which of course completely contradicts the common sense and the sense of history of other situated gazes, of other racialized minorities. And instead of creating sense of solidarity and struggle against racism, just create this sense of competitiveness, which I think is absolutely the opposite of what we want to achieve.
And I think that's a very important point to stress, and we see it in Britain in the role that anti-Semitism has played in. We know the prevalence of anti-Semitism in Britain is on the right and the far right. All evidence suggests that, and yet when you see reporting of anti-Semitism, it is only as a phenomenon on the left, where it is used to divide groups from one another. And it has played a very retrograde role. And it's interesting to see how that is mobilized, because it also seems to fit in with an anti-socialist crusade, that somehow Jews and socialism and anti-capitalism and so on, all of this, well, capitalism, you must be talking about Jews, that the tropes of anti-Semitism get used in order to undermine critical perspectives, and therefore, in practice, undermine solidarities between oppressed groups in Britain and elsewhere today, where we know, as I said at the beginning, the threat is from the far right. And yet the popular perception that the media kind of project is that somehow it is a threat on the left. And a threat to Jews on the left means it comes from blacks and Muslims and other minorities. They are the ones who are the threat to the Jews. And the division of Jews from others becomes more and more embedded in the way communal institutions in the Jewish communal institutions approach these problems.
Yes, of course, we should not deny that there have been traditions of anti-Semitism among in the traditional left, what August Babel called socialism of fools, in which the Jew was considered to embody capital. At the same time, as you very rightly saw, that Jew was also seen to be the embody of the ruthless cosmopolitan revolutionary who has no loyalty to groups and nations, and therefore cannot be trusted. So in a way, this has been exploited in many different kind of context. But because now, especially when discussing anti-Semitism in the left, the focus is not about what we can say is a trope of anti-Semitism, of looking at the Jew as dangerous, as different, as conspiratorial, and so on, but as somebody who is but see anti-Semitism of any kind of critique of Israel, this kind of thing creates this kind of division, and this kind of thing have also created this witch hunt in the Labour Party, and in regarding the Labour Party when it tried to establish some kind of a more credible socialist alternative to the neoliberal agenda.
And in fact, what it produces is also a hierarchy of racisms. On the one hand, anti-Semitism is seen as different, and on the other, where anti-Semitism is not seen as different from racism, nevertheless, the Jews are more discriminated against than other groups, as you said, like blacks and other minority ethnic groups. So either way, the current arguments treat anti-Semitism as different from other forms of racism.
Yeah, I think what is happening now, and we can see it in the Sewell report about racism against Black in Britain, is very interesting, because it tries to use the Jewish case as a kind of a model for treatment of any kind of racialization, because one of the things which is very important to do is to analyze racism in relation to other social divisions like class and gender and generation and history of migration and whatever. So part of those who said that there is a more racism against one group and another than another in the Sewell report, and it tries to link it to so-called culture and to individualize people rather than to look at their history and their socioeconomic relation and so on. And of course, to look at the attitudes as a grouping rather than just as individuals. So they're trying to say that there are certain groups of racialized minorities, especially the Indians and so on, who are now almost as successful, and although it's not said explicitly, but they're on the way to become the exemplary minority of the Jews that Margaret Thatcher used to be so proud of. Yes. And this is kind of another way of divide and rule that you related to, Richard. In the left, this is some of the way that the right is trying to do that at the moment. Yeah.
Well, and that's certainly the case with the Sewell report that came out a couple of months ago. And my reading of it is that the report was slightly less skewed towards the right. And before it was published, it was read by the government and turned more into a political document than it had been initially.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think we're approaching the end of our time. Do you think there are any other themes we ought to bring in at this point, or should we draw this to a conclusion?
Well, I think the conclusion is important. The conclusion is that it is very important to see anti-Semitism in the context and as a form of other racisms, and that this is the only way in which we can create a form of solidarity among all racialized people. And because of that, we cannot allow the cases of Jewish exceptionalism and approval of Israel, whatever it does, just because of the Holocaust, is a way of creating what for us is a very important and false contradiction and division between Jews and other racialized minorities. Because of course, it's not just one way. There are many blacks that homogenize Jews as middle-class whites who don't understand anything about racism and thinks that racism is only anti-black racism. And this is not our approach or perspective either. We think that there are many different forms of racism with different kind of histories. There are those racisms that focus on the color of the skin, those who focus on particular religions and cultures or particular accents and way of dress and particular histories. And therefore, while we should recognize and respect the different histories of different racisms and different anti-racism resistance, we should also see the similarities and the common interest of all of us to fight against all forms of racism.
Nira, thank you very much.